A 22-year-old strolls into Judge Caprio's courtroom wearing designer sunglasses, a luxury watch, and an expression that could freeze an entire room. His name? Ethan Marston, a wealthy college kid whose confidence isn't earned but inherited. He's here for what should have been a simple speeding violation. A 5-minute case at most. But what unfolds next shocks everyone in the room. As Judge Caprio begins reviewing the file, Ethan leans forward with a smirk that suggests the law doesn't apply to people like him. And then he drops a line so bold, so dripping with entitlement, that the courtroom falls into stunned silence. "You might want to be careful how you speak to me, my dad is the governor." Every head in the courtroom turns. The air thickens. The bailiff pauses mid-step. Even the pen in Judge Caprio's hand stops moving. The tension is instant and suffocating. People aren't just curious about the ruling anymore, they want to see what happens to a young man who believes power and privilege can bend justice. Will Judge Caprio lose his composure? Will he bow to political pressure? Or will he deliver a response so perfectly measured that it leaves the entire courtroom speechless? What happens next unfolds in just 15 seconds. And those 15 seconds will go down as one of the most unforgettable lessons in humility ever seen in this courtroom. Before we continue, subscribe to Real Judge Stories, so you never miss moments where real justice meets real attitude. And tell us in the comments, have you ever witnessed someone try to use power or family status to escape consequences? Because today, entitlement is about to meet reality. The moment those words left Ethan Marston's mouth, something shifted in the room. People weren't just shocked, they were uncomfortable. Not because a young man bragged about his father's power, but because of the disrespect threaded through his tone. It wasn't confidence, it was superiority. The kind that looks down on everyone else as if they are beneath you. Mothers in the room exchanged disappointed glances. A retired teacher in the front row shook her head slowly, almost heartbroken to witness such arrogance. Even the teenagers waiting for their cases sat up straighter, sensing that a line had been crossed, not a legal one but a moral one. Everyone knew this moment would reveal who Ethan truly was. Before we dive into how this powerful moment unfolded, take a second to be part of this story. Subscribe to Real Judge Stories, so you never miss real courtroom lessons that expose entitlement and highlight true character. And tell us in the comments, do you believe children of powerful families should face the same consequences as everyone else, or do most get treated differently? Your answer says a lot about the world we live in today. It was a calm Wednesday morning inside the Providence Municipal Court, the kind of morning where people hoped their cases would be quick so they could return to work, school, or everyday life. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting soft patterns across the wooden benches. The mood in the courtroom was respectful, almost gentle, as people waited quietly for their names to be called. Parents sat beside nervous teenagers, whispering last-minute reminders to be polite. A few elderly residents clutched traffic citations with shaky hands, rehearsing what they would say to Judge Caprio. The atmosphere carried a mix of anxiety, humility, and hope, the usual emotions seen in this courtroom. At the center of it all sat Judge Frank Caprio, calm as always, reviewing files with the warmth and patience that generations of Rhode Islanders have come to admire. His tone, even in routine cases, carried a sense of fairness and human understanding. People often left his courtroom not just with a ruling, but with a lesson worth remembering. No one in that room expected anything unusual to happen that day. But that changed when the bailiff called the next case. With a confident stride, sunglasses still on indoors, Ethan Marston walked to the podium as if the courtroom were an inconvenience. From the moment he entered, people sensed it. This case wouldn't be ordinary. It would test respect, authority, and the true meaning of justice. Ethan Marston wasn't just any college student. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that usually comes from accomplishment, but in his case it came from privilege. Dressed in a tailored blazer, crisp white shirt, and shoes polished to a mirror shine, he looked more prepared for a luxury brunch than a court appearance. His sunglasses remained on even as he reached the podium, as if removing them for a judge was beneath him. At first glance, someone might have mistaken him for a young professional, polite, composed, well-groomed. But it only took a few seconds to notice the subtle signs. The dismissive glance he gave to the bailiff, the impatient tapping of his designer watch, the sigh he let out when the person before him took too long with their case. It wasn't loud arrogance, not yet, but a quiet belief that none of this applied to him. Judge Caprio greeted him with his usual warmth. "Good morning, sir. Your name, please?" Ethan slid his sunglasses up onto his head, not fully removing them, and replied with a tone that lacked both respect and interest. "Ethan Marston." "No, Your Honor." No courtesy. Judge Caprio gave a small nod, making a brief note on the file. He had seen nervous people, angry people, even frustrated people, but entitlement carried its own distinct presence and he sensed it immediately. In the audience, a woman whispered to her husband, "He doesn't seem worried at all." Her husband shook his head, replying, "Kids like him never are. They think their last name solves everything." What no one knew, not yet, was just how far Ethan's confidence would go, and how quickly it would collapse. Judge Caprio lifted his eyes from the case file and offered Ethan a polite smile, the same respectful greeting he gave to every person who stood before him. "Good morning, Mr. Marston," he said, his tone steady, warm, and measured. "I see here you were cited for traveling 57 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour residential zone. Can you tell me what happened?" There was no accusation in his voice, no frustration, only an opportunity for Ethan to explain himself responsibly. Ethan shifted his stance, casually placing one hand in his pocket. "It was early, the road was empty. I was running late. Didn't think it was that serious," he replied. "Still no, Your Honor. Still no respect." Judge Caprio nodded slowly, processing the answer. For a moment, his expression remained neutral, but there was a hint of concern behind his eyes, not for the charge itself but for the attitude behind it. "I understand mornings can be rushed," Judge Caprio responded gently. "But that area has crosswalks and families nearby. Speed limits are set for safety, not inconvenience." Rather than acknowledging the point, Ethan shrugged, a faint smirk forming. "Yeah, but nothing happened. No one was around." A soft murmur spread across the courtroom, the kind that comes when someone says something everyone else knows is wrong but can't believe they said out loud. Judge Caprio took a breath, remaining composed. He had dealt with anger, fear, guilt, and regret in his courtroom, but entitlement required a different kind of patience. And this case was about to test that patience more than most. Judge Caprio, still composed, gently adjusted his glasses and continued, "Mr. Marston, the officer noted you passed two vehicles at high speed and did not slow near a pedestrian crossing. That's concerning. Were you aware of the crosswalks in that area?" Ethan let out a small laugh, not a humorous one, but the kind that carried disbelief that this conversation was even happening. "Look, Judge, I'm a careful driver. I wasn't going to hit anyone. If anything, the officer was just exaggerating. You know how some of them are." A visible shift occurred in the room. A man seated in the second row, likely a parent, frowned and folded his arms. A teenage girl shook her head, whispering to her friend, "Can you believe this guy?" Judge Caprio's expression remained steady, but his voice gained a gentle firmness. "Mr. Marston, officers risk their lives daily to enforce safety. It's important we show respect for the work they do." Ethan rolled his eyes, not dramatically but enough that several people noticed. "Sure, but I mean, sometimes they pull people over just to meet quotas. Everybody knows that." This time, the reaction in the courtroom was immediate. A soft gasp, followed by the uncomfortable shifting of bodies on wooden benches. For the first time, even the bailiff raised an eyebrow. Judge Caprio paused for a moment, not out of anger but to choose his words with care. "Are you suggesting the officer issued this citation unfairly?" Ethan shrugged again, leaning casually on the podium. "I'm saying maybe he picked the wrong person to annoy that morning." The entitlement was no longer subtle. It was clear, sharp, and unsettling. A woman in the front row whispered to the retired teacher beside her, "He's digging himself deeper." The teacher replied softly, "This is what happens when someone grows up believing rules are optional." Judge Caprio kept his tone controlled, but the warmth had cooled slightly, replaced with a calm, measured seriousness. "Mr. Marston, this courtroom is not an inconvenience. We are here to ensure fairness and safety for the community. I ask that you approach these proceedings with respect." Ethan's lips curved into a smirk, the kind that said he still wasn't taking any of this seriously. And that smirk would soon become the reason everything changed. Judge Caprio began to speak again, but Ethan lifted his hand slightly as if signaling someone to stop talking. The gesture alone caused a ripple of disbelief through the room. "Judge," Ethan said, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone, "I think we're wasting time here. Maybe you don't realize who you're talking to." He leaned closer to the microphone, eyes fixed on Judge Caprio with a slow, confident smirk. "My father is the governor. So I'd watch how you speak to me if I were you." The room froze. There were no whispers this time, only silence. A heavy, uncomfortable silence that wrapped around everyone present. A woman pressed her hand to her mouth. A teenager muttered under his breath, "He didn't just say that." Even the bailiff, who had seen years of courtroom behavior, stiffened. Ethan straightened his blazer as if he had just sealed the discussion, as if his father's title had just rewritten the rules. In that moment the atmosphere shifted completely. This was no longer about speeding. It was about respect, power, and the belief that status places someone above the law. And everyone waited, breath held, for Judge Caprio's response. For a moment, it felt as if the entire courtroom forgot how to breathe. Judge Caprio didn't respond immediately, and that silence was far louder than any words could have been. He simply looked at Ethan. Not angrily, not surprised, but with a steady, unreadable calm that made the young man's confidence flicker for the first time. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 8. 10. People shifted in their seats, but carefully, as if any sudden movement might break something fragile. A mother gently placed her hand on her son's arm, reminding him without words, "This is what disrespect looks like, and this is what it leads to." A retired veteran in the back straightened his posture, his jaw tightening. A teenage girl, wide-eyed, whispered, "He's in trouble now." Ethan swallowed, suddenly aware that the room wasn't reacting the way he expected. He had assumed his father's title would intimidate the judge, that it would end the conversation. Instead, the silence was stripping his arrogance bare, exposing insecurity he had never needed to hide before. Judge Caprio finally leaned back slightly in his chair, hands folded, eyes never leaving Ethan's. The entire courtroom leaned forward, waiting for the response that everyone knew would define everything that followed. Judge Caprio didn't raise his voice. He didn't frown. He simply let the silence settle a few seconds longer before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was quieter than before, yet somehow much stronger. "Mr. Marston," he began, tone controlled and steady, "I want to make sure I heard you correctly." His gaze remained fixed on Ethan, not confrontational but deeply intentional. "You just implied that I should watch how I speak to you, because your father is the governor. Is that what you meant?" Ethan lifted his chin, attempting to reclaim his confidence. "I'm just saying you might want to be aware of who you're dealing with here." Judge Caprio repeated the words softly, almost to himself as if tasting their weight. "Be aware of who I'm dealing with." He nodded slowly, then leaned forward just a little, not in challenge but with clarity. "Mr. Marston, in this courtroom I deal with citizens. Fathers, mothers, students, workers, retirees, people from every walk of life. And I treat them all with the same respect. Your father's title does not change how this court operates." There was no anger. No sarcasm. Just truth, delivered with precision. A subtle shift could be felt in the room. People weren't just hearing a judge speak. They were witnessing a lesson beginning to form. One Ethan wasn't prepared for. That Ethan's brief moment of uncertainty quickly faded as he exhaled and straightened his shoulders, determined not to lose ground. He forced a small laugh, trying to appear unfazed by Judge Caprio's calm response. "Look, Judge," he said, adopting a tone that mimicked patience but bled with condescension, "I respect what you do here. Really I do. But let's be realistic. My father isn't just any public official. If he knew I was being, let's say, handled unfairly, he wouldn't be too happy about it." There was that word again, handled. As if this courtroom were a customer service desk and he was an unhappy VIP client expecting priority treatment. A low murmur moved through the courtroom. One woman shook her head in disbelief. The retired veteran crossed his arms, unimpressed. The tension that had briefly eased tightened again. Ethan continued, unaware of how badly he was misreading the room. "I mean, we both know how these things usually go. A fine, a warning, whatever. We don't need to make this bigger than it is. I'm sure we can come to a mutually sensible outcome here." A teenager whispered to his friend, "Is he trying to negotiate with a judge?" Judge Caprio remained still, letting Ethan's words hang in the air, giving them room to reveal their full arrogance. Because now Ethan wasn't just invoking privilege. He was attempting to influence justice. And that changed everything. Judge Caprio took a slow breath, set his pen down gently and folded his hands. When he spoke, his voice was soft, but carried a weight that instantly quieted every corner of the room. "Mr. Marston," he began, "let me tell you exactly who I'm dealing with today." Ethan's smirk eased just slightly, his confidence no longer as solid as before. "I'm dealing with a young man who was driving nearly twice the speed limit in a residential neighborhood. I'm dealing with someone who shrugged at the idea of endangering families and children just trying to cross the street. And I'm dealing with someone who believes that his father's position gives him immunity from the law." Ethan opened his mouth to interrupt, but Caprio lifted one finger, not aggressively, just enough to pause him. "I know your father, Governor Marston," Judge Caprio continued, his tone steady but sharpened by truth. "I've spoken with him on more than one occasion. He worked his way up, with discipline, respect, and public service. And if he were standing in your place right now, I have no doubt he would be ashamed of how you're behaving." A few people inhaled quietly. Ethan's face lost a hint of color. "You're not here because of who your father is," Caprio said. "You're here because of a choice you made. And the sooner you understand that your last name is not a shield but a responsibility, the better your life will be." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The power in the room had shifted, completely. Judge Caprio allowed a brief silence to follow his last words, giving them space to sink in before continuing, not just for Ethan but for every person witnessing the exchange. "You know, Mr. Marston," he said gently, "there's something important I want you to understand. Life will give you advantages, some earned, some given to you. Having a father in a position of power is not something to be ashamed of. But the real measure of a person is not the status they inherit, it is the character they choose to display." Ethan stared at the podium, the confidence he walked in with now visibly shaken. "Privilege," Caprio continued, "is not a free pass. It is a responsibility. A responsibility to show humility, to treat others with respect, and to remember that titles don't make you better than anyone else. Your behavior today tells me you have not learned that yet." He leaned back slightly, his tone now softer, almost fatherly. "I've seen young people from very difficult backgrounds come into this courtroom terrified, yet they speak with more respect than you have shown today. They have no connections, no influence, no safety net, only accountability. Yet they stand here with dignity." A woman in the audience nodded, moved by the truth in his words. "When you invoked your father's name," he went on, "you didn't protect him. You diminished the reputation he worked hard to build. A good parent wants their children to grow into honest, respectful human beings, not individuals who misuse their family name to avoid consequences." Judge Caprio paused, letting the weight of that sentence land. Ethan's jaw tightened, not out of defiance this time, but out of realization. "Someday, Mr. Marston, you may hold a position of influence yourself. And in that moment people will look to you as a leader. Ask yourself, what kind of leader will you be? One who demands respect through fear or status, or one who earns it through integrity?" Silence filled the room again, but this silence felt different. It wasn't tense anymore. It was reflective. For the first time since he entered the courtroom, Ethan's eyes lowered, not with arrogance, but with something that looked like humility beginning to surface. Judge Caprio took a moment to review the citation again before delivering his decision. Not rushed, not emotional, simply thoughtful. When he spoke, his tone remained calm, but there was no hesitation. "Mr. Marston, there must be consequences for your actions, not because of who your father is, but because of the choice you made." Ethan lifted his eyes, bracing himself. "For driving 27 miles over the limit in a residential zone, I am imposing a fine of $450. Ethan blinked but didn't argue. The fine was expected. "However," Judge Caprio continued, "a fine alone won't teach you the lesson that needs to be learned here." A few people in the courtroom leaned forward, listening as if this was the part they had been waiting for. "You will complete an in-person defensive driving course, 8 hours, not online. You'll sit in a classroom with other drivers who made similar mistakes and learn why speed limits exist. Not for inconvenience but for safety." Ethan swallowed hard. The embarrassment of sitting among ordinary people was a consequence he had not anticipated. "And there is one more requirement," Caprio added. "You will complete 20 hours of community service, specifically with a youth traffic safety program. You will speak to teenagers about responsible driving and the importance of respecting the law." Ethan's expression shifted. This one hit deeper. It wasn't just punishment. It was accountability. Judge Caprio's voice softened slightly. "Teaching others has a way of teaching ourselves. My hope, Mr. Marston, is that by helping young people avoid your mistake, you'll understand why this matters." There was no anger in his decision, only fairness, growth, and purpose. Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of the ruling settling on him like a lesson he could no longer ignore. For a few seconds after Judge Caprio finished speaking, the courtroom remained silent, not out of shock this time but out of respect. Then, slowly, a quiet murmur began to spread among those seated. A middle-aged woman wearing a teacher's ID lanyard leaned slightly forward and whispered, That was exactly what he needed to hear." Her voice carried the tone of someone who had spent years trying to teach young people values that went far beyond textbooks. The retired veteran in the back row nodded firmly, his voice low but steady. "That's leadership. Come. Fair. No favoritism. That's how you earn respect, not demand it. His statement wasn't just admiration, it was relief. Relief that fairness still existed in places where many feared privilege could overshadow justice. A teenage boy sitting beside his mother exhaled softly, as if he'd been holding his breath the entire time. "Mom, if I ever talk to a judge like that, or anyone like that." His mother raised a brow. "You wouldn't." He swallowed. "Not after seeing this." A young man who had been waiting for his own speeding case wiped his palms on his jeans and whispered to the person next to him, "I was nervous before, but now I feel like if I'm honest, he'll treat me fairly." "That's the point," the woman beside him replied. "Respect goes both ways." Even those who had originally come anxious about their own cases now sat with a strange sense of gratitude, not for the penalties they would face, but for the reminder that justice wasn't reserved for the privileged. Judge Caprio hadn't just ruled on a case. He had restored faith in the courtroom. Ethan stood at the podium longer than necessary, almost as if his legs needed a moment to remember how to move. The arrogance that carried him into the courtroom had dissolved into something unfamiliar, something uncomfortable but necessary. For the first time he didn't look at Judge Caprio with defiance. He looked at him with reflection. "Your Honor," he began quietly, and the softness in his voice made several people glance up. I understand. I didn't realize how I sounded. I wasn't thinking about anyone but myself." There was no dramatic apology, no sudden transformation into a model citizen. But the shift was visible and genuine. Judge Caprio nodded once, acknowledging the effort, but not feeding into the moment with excessive praise. Growth requires accountability, not applause. "I hope you carry this lesson forward, Mr. Marston," Caprio said. "You won't be the last person to face a difficult moment. But how you choose to behave in those moments will define you far more than your last name." Ethan lowered his gaze, absorbing the words like someone hearing them not for punishment but for guidance. As he finally stepped away from the podium, the way he walked had changed. His steps were slower, more thoughtful. He no longer moved like someone untouchable, but like someone who had been touched by truth. No one clapped. No one cheered. They didn't need to. The lesson itself was enough. As Ethan returned to his seat, the atmosphere in the courtroom felt noticeably different. The tension that had filled the space earlier had settled into a quiet calm, not of relief but of reflection. People weren't just thinking about what Ethan had done, they were thinking about what they had just witnessed. Judge Caprio took a brief pause before calling the next case, allowing the room, and perhaps Ethan, a moment to breathe. He didn't look triumphant, nor did he seem burdened. His expression was the same one he wore for every case, composed, compassionate, and steady. The bailiff began organizing the next file, and life in the courtroom slowly resumed. Yet the energy in the room had shifted. People sat a little straighter, spoke a little softer, and carried themselves with a touch more humility. Some exchanged small smiles, not because they had enjoyed Ethan's discomfort, but because they had witnessed something rare, a moment where justice wasn't just enforced but taught. Judge Caprio glanced briefly in Ethan's direction with a look that held no judgment, only hope. Hope that the lesson given would outlast the consequences assigned. It was a reminder to everyone present. Courtrooms don't just settle cases. Sometimes they shape character. What happened in that courtroom was more than a speeding case, more than a confrontation between a judge and an entitled young man. It was a reminder of a truth many forget in a world obsessed with status, fame, influence, and last names. Respect is not inherited. Character is not passed down. Humility cannot be bought. They are choices, made daily by how we treat others. Ethan walked into that courtroom believing power placed him above accountability. But the moment his entitlement collided with Judge Caprio's calm wisdom, the illusion shattered. Not with anger, not with punishment alone, but with clarity and truth. Many people move through life believing connections protect them, wealth defines them, or family name elevates them. But life has a way of revealing that the real currency of respect comes from integrity, empathy, and how we speak to people who can do nothing for us in return. Judge Caprio didn't humiliate Ethan. He guided him. He didn't crush his confidence. He redirected it. He didn't attack his privilege. He taught him how to use it with responsibility. And that is a lesson every viewer, regardless of background, can take with them. Because whether in a courtroom, at school, at work, or in the world, the measure of a person is never who their parents are. It is who they choose to be when no title can protect them. Before you scroll, take a moment to reflect on what you just witnessed. If you believe Judge Caprio handled this situation with fairness, wisdom, and integrity, then share this story so others can learn from it too. Do you think the consequences he gave Ethan were enough? Or should he have been stricter? Comment your answer below. Your perspective matters. If you want more real courtroom moments that reveal character, teach life lessons, and prove that respect still matters, make sure you subscribe to Real Judge Stories and turn on notifications. Because in a world where entitlement often goes unchecked, we need reminders like this more than ever.